Invite Zanzi. Oh yeah, Black Sun in the Hizzle. All for shizzle dizzle. We got an excellent show here today. Turn the lights on. Turn the lights on. Okay, y'all. All right. What's happening? What's happening? Got Zanzi in the Hizzle for shizzle. We got Deacon. We got Twin, man. How y'all doing? How y'all doing? Man, happy Sunday to everybody. Oh shit, damn collar looking like damn Fonzie here. Okay. All right. All right, let's buckle that up. All right, so waiting for Zanzi to get here. Zanzi just dang text me and I was just oh there we go. Zanzi was good, man. Was good.
Hey, what's up? I'm very good, and yourself?
Man, good, good today, man. Getting ready for another week, man. Just I had to order a motherboard and damn they sent me the wrong one. So Amazon charged me a restocking fee. So
Really?
yeah, man.
How do you justify that?
I don't know. That's what I like to know. So I gotta
I,
wait till Monday to talk to them because they not open today. So
I send something back to Amazon at least once a week. I've never been charged a restocking fee, so that's
right,
weird.
that is weird, man. So yeah, I'm gonna find out because trust me, I'm gonna dispute that shit. So man, so how you doing, man? Shoot,
Oh,
what's going
very
on?
good, very good. I spent yesterday. I hadn't shot a bow and arrow in
Oh
20 years, and that's what I did yesterday with my friend, and I
yeah.
had fun. I just bought a bow, and I don't regret my choice.
Oh okay. How do you like the crossbow?
I don't have a crossbow. I
Mm.
can't have a crossbow in Canada.
Oh, you can't have a crossbow in Canada?
No, you need a weapons permit for it.
Oh, did not know that. Damn, I know
Yeah.
they're harder to
I'm
come
allowed the
by.
bow and arrow, but I'm not allowed a crossbow.
Yeah, that doesn't make no sense, but okay. I guess because crossbows have more pressure than a bow and
I
arrow, I guess.
guess they can shoot stronger, but also they're
Yeah.
easier to shoot, right? In the sense that you just load it,
Oh
crank it,
yeah.
and
Mhm.
it's a trigger, right?
Yep.
So
Damn.
it's easier to conceal. Just get out
Right.
and shoot, right? You can have it preloaded. So those
Yeah.
are all things that are not really possible with a bow.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. That's true. Man. So yeah, man. Yeah, it's been a minute since I've had a cross. In fact, yeah, it's been a minute. Damn. But yeah, man. Yeah, just getting ready for the new week, man. So but anything interesting in the news?
In the news,
Hmm.
Quebec, our province, is the only one. Well, not the only one. That's not true, but is one that specifically went out of his way to say that we won't have a holiday tomorrow for the funerals of the Queen.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I
So
remember
I
you.
have to
Yeah.
work tomorrow. That sucks. Yeah.
Oh, dang. Y'all didn't take a vote on it? I mean, or they just decided, hey, we're not gonna do that.
Well, Canada, as a country, decided that tomorrow was a holiday, but they really can enforce it or
Oh,
declare it
yeah.
only for federal workers, right? So they
Yeah.
declared it for federal workers, and some
Okay.
provinces said that, yeah, we're also going to give a holiday for that day, but some
Right.
didn't. Quebec
Yeah.
is one that didn't, because we're in a political campaign right now, and apparently that's more important than the Queen's death.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, well shoot, man. So okay, well let's get to this let's get down to business here. I know you
Yeah.
wanna because we've been throwing this word socialism all over. I know I have, even in conversations, it seems like we can't avoid bringing up socialism, So we got to get your definition and what was it? You said you were going to define it and then I guess have a
Well,
discussion on application. Or
I prepared a little presentation, right?
okay, cool.
That I created from. Oh, okay, there we go.
Yep.
That I created from um, a document. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
from a document that I found that brought together, well, the Communist Manifesto, of course, because that's the main piece that we
Right.
might not talk about today, actually, because there's a
Okay.
lot of context around it. So I'm not sure how long it's going to take us to go through all this. So we might
Okay.
not be able to actually touch the manifesto in itself.
Okay.
But this document, why it was interesting, is that it brought forward the manifesto, but also the different prefaces, because every time the manifesto was translated in different languages, Marx and Engels, mostly Engels, because Marx died
Right.
shortly after the, the first reedition, the first translation. Um, they would include a preface to those publications, talking about how the context, or how the principles enunciated in the manifesto were still, or weren't still to some extent, applicable to the current time, and how different events
Right.
um, would impact those principles that are enunciated, right?
Right.
And they would also try to reiterate some things that might have been already in their lifetime misunderstood by some branches of activists around the world, right?
Right.
And there's also in that document, and those are the things that we are most likely to touch today. Um, the two documents that Engels and Marx worked on um, in the year before the first publication of the Communist Manifesto. They were called, we'll see later. Well, those two documents that we'll see later, they they went over pretty much the same principles, the same um, declarations that the manifesto did, but in a more structured way. So I thought that it would be interesting to go through those first, because they bring
Right.
some context to the ideas in the manifesto, but also they kind of structure them a little bit more clearly, so that when we go into the much more theoretical manifesto, it's easier compartmentalize the
Yeah.
different aspects of it, because that's what the draft did to some extent, and also included a little bit, because we always discuss, right, or we've discussed a lot the role of the state in end game communism, if we will, right?
Right.
And I just took the exact wordings, or the exact quotes from Frederick Engels in 1877, when he pretty much defined, or when he explained exactly what he meant by the withering of the state and the disappearance of the state in the endgame communism, right? So
Mhm.
that's a little bit how it's going to go. There's going to be a lot of stuff that people can write, right? Everything that's in the presentation, those are the direct words of Marx and Engels. There's nothing else than that. There's some things that I wrote, but those will be clearly uh, uh, identifiable, like
Right.
this little part right here. That's something I wrote. Whenever a manifesto gets translated in different language, Marx and Engels, right? So they don't talk about themselves in the third person. So
Right.
whenever
Right.
they're named, they're usually not naming themselves. Engels will talk about Marx quite a lot. Marx, not so much about Engels, though.
Okay.
All right. So I think the first, oops, is that, yeah. So the first things that were said in those prefaces, we're going to look at the prefaces first, was that even though, right, the first preface, the first translation of the manifesto was in 1872. 1847 or 1848 is the release of the manifesto. 1872, the first publication that came with a preface from Marx and Engels. Um, and they basically said at that time that even 25 years after the first publication of the principle of the Communist Manifesto, the general principles laid by it are still correct, as they always were. And I find it interesting that even though we have to keep in mind that everything they're talking about was written in the middle of the 19th century, uh, much of it is surprisingly still of actuality, right? Um, and they kind of saw some things coming, right? Because like I've said before, our world is much less capitalistic than it was back in their days, right? The 19th centuries, the middle of the 19th centuries is a hellscape for workers in industry, right? um, we've got child labor, right? We've got people dying of black lung in coal factories, and then dying of different accidents, right? So it's those are not the best working conditions, right?
Right.
Let's say it like that. And well, the different social programs and the different regulations that we've got in industries nowadays, right? They're direct result of those principles enunciated in the Communist Manifesto. They're and the social democracy that we have nowadays was predicted and was born um, during the time of Marx and Engels, and they interacted with it and had a particular idea of it. So what they do mention here is that the practical application of the principles will depend, as the manifesto itself states, everywhere and at all times on the historical conditions for the time being existing, and for that reason, no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of section 2. So, when we're going to go in the actual manifesto, at some point they do talk more about implementation, right, of different principles, how to put them into action in their current world, right? But in the manifesto itself and in the prefaces, they always make a point to remember, to try to remind to people that the application of those principles cannot um, cannot be stated without taking account of the historical reality of the different populations, right? They do state later on, we'll see that um, it's very important to have the whole global community adhere to those principles, but the way to get there, uh, it's going to be different for every population. And they do say that for that reason, the practical principles of application that they propose in the section 2 of the manifesto, there's no they're still important, but there's no special stress as it has to be done in that way, right? Those steps are a suggestion, an idea of the kind of measures that could be implemented. um, and they do address how those measures should be chosen, right? The whole point of the Communist Manifesto is to give power back to the workers to some extent through the political system. So those elements of the prefaces were really present when they were written by Marx and Engels, but in 1883, after Marx's death, um, Engels his preface to the 1883 edition was very much about making sure that the ideas, the theoretical ideas of how the economical production systems work throughout history, from the class relations of ancient times between master and slaves to through the relations of the medieval times, through the serf and feudal lords, then through the manufacture era toward the guild masters and the guild members of different manufacturing industries, and now in the world in which Marx and Engels lived, the fight between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? So he took a um, special interest of making the preface of the first edition after the death of Marx to credit those ideas to Marx, right? To make sure to remember to people that even though he's seen Engels as a very important part of Marxism, that this is still Marx's idea at the core, right? So he just lost a very close friend, so it's understandable that this professor was much more emotional. Some people might see it as him trying to detach himself from the movement, but in actuality, he never really did detach himself from the movement. So um, that is not likely to be the case. Then in 1888, uh, he takes special time in the preface to make sure to differentiate socialism and communism. The manifesto in itself, as a whole section, uh, trying to differentiate socialism from communism by explaining the different kind of socialism and why they are not to be considered the same thing as communism, right? And in the preface of 1888, he does take time to try and skim over why this is not the case. And again, to explain that. Um, right. So to explain that there's been different discoveries since then that kind of further the idea of common ownership of land in the primeval tribal societies. Um, then, well, like I've said, leading up to the manifesto, we've had a couple of documents that were not shared with the larger public in itself. They were published later on, mostly after their death, but those are the documents that um, served as draft to the Communist Manifesto. Right. The first of those documents was called A Communist Confession of Faith. Now, I'm expecting, Blackson, that you're gonna have some comments about the title of this document. Oh, are you still there? Have I been talking alone for a while now? Oh, dar Blackson. Okay, interesting.
No, sorry about that.
Oh,
My mic was muted. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So now, okay, now what were you saying?
I was saying that I was expecting you to have a comment or an opinion about the titling of the first draft of the manifesto, A Communist Confession of Faith.
Of fate. I mean, no, I'm just listening.
Okay,
I
but
mean, yeah,
in any case, right?
yeah,
Um, they chose to name it a Communist Confession of Faith, right? That was
right.
their first idea, and well, because in some sense, communism is about abolishing a lot of parts, many parts of our current societal structure. One of the part that they wanted to abolish was existing all existing religions, right?
Religions,
So
right, right.
to have their document uh, have an appearance of a catechism or some kind of faith faith-based ideas was not what they wanted to carry along. So they modified that. But the principles that they enunciated, even though much more fleshed out in the second draft document and in the manifesto, they are still already present in shorter form. So sometime in more understandable form. So I haven't put all the different questions and answers because a lot of them goes to why it's important to uh, right a, a, a lot of different aspect of the manifesto being a manifesto also aim to encourage people towards revolution and make them realize the power that they have, right? And that's not as much about the ideas of communism, just about as it is about the mobilization of individuals, right? So I didn't think too pertinent to include them in the discussion tonight. But if we ever go and discuss how revolution starts and what are the good way to have them start, then those parts of the manifesto might be an interesting thing to add to the discussion. But that's a completely different subject in my mind. So one of the questions that were was asked in a communist confession of faith was as simple as it can be: what is the aim of the communists? The first question is a funny one. it's a was simply, "Are you a communist?" And the answer to it was yes. So basically they're saying that everybody's a communist, right? So
Right.
that goes more into the trying to preach, convert, or trying to mobilize people, right? Is just a hook, right? You read that, the first question, "Are you one of us?" The answer is yes. Why am I one of you, right? So what's the aim of the communist, right? If I'm a communist, what's my aim? So, the short answer to that was to organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all its capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic condition of this society. That sounds fair, doesn't it?
Um, I mean, I mean, there's a lot
Not
of
not trying to extrapolate anything, right?
right,
Just
right,
trying
right.
to
Okay,
look
okay.
at those
Oh, you
words
just saying
and
okay, okay. I'm like, okay, keep going, keep going. Yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. I didn't know if you were
no, no. But what
asking
I'm
me.
saying is the words are there. If we're not trying to put historical background from what's to come in the future, right? Because that's in
Mhm.
1847. That sounds fair. They want to have a society in which everyone can use all of their capabilities and powers in complete freedom, right? That sounds that's something that people
So
can be.
how do you define freedom?
Oh, well, they do in the document, and we'll talk
Mhm.
extensively about it. But I
Okay.
mean, we're just looking at those words seems fair to some extent, right? It doesn't seem like something that's inherently to be rejected, right? Um, then we've got question three, that was, how do you wish to achieve this aim, right? And the answer was by the elimination of private property and its replacement by community of property, right? Um, so that's uh, an aspect that is more again fleshed out in the manifesto itself and in the second draft document. Um, but they do approach it in. Oh, wow, what's going on there? Is it flickering
Oh
in your
shoot!
screen
Oh
too?
shoot! Oh, wait, wait. Oh, okay. Yeah, it is flickering. What the hell?
It's not flickering in mine. There we go. Okay.
Okay.
So I skipped over a couple of questions in this document, right? We went from 3 to 13, but most of the other questions were about um, the uh, the proletariat and the historic development behind the proletariat. That that's something we'll see more through the second document where it's more fleshed out. But here they do ask uh, that well, they do state that according to what they're preaching or what they're saying, the communists do not believe that community of property has been possible at any time beforehand, right? Because when they go to the historicity of the proletariat and the clash of classes, it does become apparent that owning property in a communal way wouldn't have been possible before the industrial revolution, right? And they do state that the ideas of communism are only possible now that machinery and other inventions that appeared um, shortly before, right, during the 18th century, uh, made it possible to um, to advance. Well, to have progress and advancement being all encompassing for everybody, right? That all members of society are able to benefit from it because we're not at a time where it's possible to produce enough for everybody, right? With those machines. So they make it clear that those ideas, they kind of depend on the current situation, right? If we didn't have the current situation, communism wouldn't be a solution to it. Communism is specifically a solution to capitalism, right? To the rise of modern day bourgeoisie, as Marx and Engels would call it. Now, uh, they do present some they, as much as some people think that revolution implies uh, a complete 180 in short fell swoop. It's not necessarily the case, right? They don't necessarily believe in slow reform. They believe in drastic actions, but drastic actions that can be taken gradually, right? They do understand that you're not going to change everything in society and in economy and in the concept of property in one day because you tell people that's the way it is, right? There's an aspect of doing things gradually uh, at the rhythm of the people to some extent because it is for the people the way they present it, the way that they approach it, right? Because we'll see that later on the different other thinkers brought on the ideas of dictature of the proletariat, right? And but the ideas presented by Marx and Engels, they all go through democracy. They all go through the workers being able to have a presence in the political arena, which they couldn't in their time, right? If you didn't, you needed to have that much money to be able to vote, right? And workers just couldn't be part of the political apparatus, right? So that was one of their demand to make it so that the workers could unite as a party and enter the democratic arena and have their concerns and voiced. And the goal of communism, to some extent, was to unite the workers in these ideas that took their existence as workers, right, and be able to turn it into a change of society. Um, so they do think they do um, right they do know that um, it's it has to be through democratical means, right? They do know that it's all about the worker being able to have a constitution written for the proletariat, right? For the masses, for the majority of the people, which wasn't a thing back in their day, right? Especially not in Germany where they couldn't vote, in England where they couldn't vote, right? Um, Now, when it comes to how will you do this, well, they had 3 points, right? That would be greatly expanded upon in further writings, but it boils down to limiting private property, in a gradual way, of course, starting with in order to make it become social property, right? Examples that they give here at that time was through progressive taxation, limitation of the right of inheritance, things like that, right? Um, they also want to make sure that people contribute to society, right? So if you're gonna make those methods of production uh, owned by the society itself, you have to make sure to be able to manage those employees and employ, right? Act as a, they wouldn't call it like that back then, but I guess human resources department from all the people, all the members of society that contributes to it, right? And that's the third point is an example of one thing that they brought to our societies, right? By educating all children at the expense of the state. So back in those days, children were in factories. right? They weren't in school. The children that were in school were the children of rich people that went to those private schools, right? There weren't no schools funded by the state, no mandatory school for children up to a certain age, right? Uh, Now, most what we call developed societies, right, or industrial societies, do have some kind of public schooling available for all children, mandatory schooling up to a certain age, right? I know that in Canada, you have to go all the way through high school, um, at least the third grade of high school, technically. You're supposed to do more, but hey. Um, I don't know in the United States, what's the minimum state funded education in the United States? Like, hello? All right. Maybe a mic problem again. In any case, we'll move on.
I believe
So,
it's I think eighth grade. I'm not sure, but I believe after eighth grade you can skip legally skip high school, but you have to go through middle school or what some states call junior high school. So I'm guessing if somebody want to click the link and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe, and I'm not sure it's eighth grade. To answer your question.
all right. Well, so that's also something that ultimately came from the ideas of socialists and communists, right? Um, Now, this last question, question 21 from the Confession of Fate of Communist Confession of Fate, was about nationalities, right? Will they continue to exist under communism? And the answer to that was that they will, to an extent, for a time, but the expectation is that as classes disappear and this kind of competition between classes will disappear and this kind of cooperation between societies will appear, that at that point, the concept of nationality in the way we see it today is bound to disappear by itself at some point, right? And that's something that will be touched more with the concept of the withering of the state, exactly how this process will take place. Because we're not talking about cultural identities here, but specifically nationalities and the concept of nations as seen back in their days and as kind of seen today to some extent, even though people on the side of capitalism as well as on the side of communism seems to be tending toward a globalist attitude that would get rid of nations altogether. So that's an interesting observation to my mind that both end of the spectrum kind of agree on that part, it seems. Um, Now, also in 1847, they reworked that document under the name "The Principle of Communism." It still have the same form of question and answers, but um, it was much more long form. The points were much more explained. I abridged it considerably to this presentation. Again, like everything that I say all the time, I encourage everybody to go and look at those sources themselves. Right? You're never gonna make a better idea to yourself of what those things says that by reading them yourselves. Um, what I intend to show with this presentation is that it as even though it's a quite complex issue, what they actually say about communism and what it is quite simple. What they say about the history behind what led us to here and the fight between the classes and why the proletariat is such an important class that should unionize in order to get political power. That part is complicated and can be interpreted in many ways, but the principle of communism themselves are pretty straightforward and simple. Um, So again, same kind of questions are asked, right? Because it's still a draft of the same document to some extent, and they ask the question, "What is communism?" Right? And at that point, they answer it by saying that communism is the doctrine of the condition of the liberation of the proletariat. Right? Already a much more theoretical way to state it, right? Because you have to understand what exactly is the doctrine and what exactly are the conditions of the liberation of whatever is the proletariat, right? So that's why I guess they then straightforward, straight asked, what is the proletariat, right? And to that, they answer that the proletariat is a class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woes, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat, or the class of proletarians, is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century. So, do you understand, Blackstone, exactly what they mean by that? Why would we'll see after, because they do compare the proletariat with different working classes of different eras, some of which overlap with the 19th century and the early 20th century, right? But and still 21st century to some extent. But you understand what makes the proletariat, right? Blackson? I'm asking you because I could ask the chat also, but it makes for a more active conversation when I ask you. I do. Oh, okay. So yeah, I see that you answered in the chat. All right. So yes, the main point, right, is how they say that the proletariat, they sell their labor, right? They don't sell something that they build directly. They sell their labor, right? They work in a factory, they worked on an industrial machine, and they just sell their ability to operate this machine or to effectuate the part of the chain of supply that they're working on, right? So that's something that was new to the industrial era, right? Before that, you had manufacturers in which people uh, tried to do on a larger scale uh, in a manufacturing plant the work faster, right? But they were still doing everything by hand, so they had a connection to what they were doing. It was not an easily replaceable skill as acting or actuating a lever might be in a factory, right? Um, Now, they do ask. Oh, there we go again with flickering. That's free software for you. All right. So the next question asked is then, proletarians then have not always existed, and no, there's always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor, but there's not always been workers and poor living. There's not always been workers and poor people living under the condition as they are today. In other words, they have not always been proletarians any more than there always have been free and bridal competition. Um, so they do understand that yes, poor people and people being exploited is not a new thing, but the way they've been exploited and the conditions of the world in which they're living did change, and that's what makes them different from the different exploited class that came before. Now we've got a very, very, very long block of text that I'll leave on the screen for a while if you want to read it. That basically explain how the industrial revolution, uh, by completely changing the modes of production, simplifying them to some kind of extent to make production faster and cheaper, turned the labor of the worker into more of a commodity that can be exchanged than an actual skill that was sought, right? So uh, you didn't have a craft or have a trade as much as you were a cog in a machine, right? And they don't see that the being a cog in a machine, the being replaceable, the machinery, the industrialization has been something bad. They are on the other, quite the contrary. They find it's a wonderful thing, but that because the means of production change in that way, it's important that society changes with it, right? And they do denounce that the way that the society works right now, uh, that the capitalist, as they come them, the bourgeoisie, um, found a way to take those new methods of productions. They were new at their time, right? And make them work for them individually instead of for society, right? So they do explain that in the same way that the bourgeoisie took over those different industries locally, they then took over the the world to some extent with those principles of production. And the proletariat and the shift of the workforce toward this replaceable position is how the proletariat originates to some extent. Now, they do describe also in this document, in better words than I could, exactly what are those new conditions under which the sale of labor of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place. And they do explain what I touched on a little bit before, which is that labor is now seen as a commodity like any other. And it's the price is therefore determined, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws as applied to other commodities. In a regime of big industry or of free competition, as we shall see, the two comes to the same thing. The price of a commodity is, on the average, always equal to its cost of production. Hence, the price of labor is also equal to the cost of production of labor. But what that means when you treat human beings as commodity is that the cost of production of labor consists of precisely the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to enable the worker to continue working and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more for his labor than is necessary for his purpose. For this purpose, the price of labor or the wage will, in other words, be the lowest, the minimum required for the maintenance of life. Now, back in their days, that was everybody, right? You worked in the factory. Well, you took whatever scraps they threw at you, and you were lucky enough if you could live off of it. And if, especially, well, your family, your children had to go do the same factory work because you could certainly not get a salary big enough to make them live off your salary, right? Now, it changed nowadays, right? But we do have this concept of a minimum wage, right? I know we have it in Canada. I'm pretty sure you still have it in the United States. Um, Out of curiosity, what is the minimum wage in the United States? I'm looking at the chat right now. If someone maybe knows the answer, I don't. $9, right? So $9, right? In Canada, it's $14. It depends on the province. In Quebec, it's $14.25 Canadian, which has to be close to $10 American, or no, it's a little bit more, like 11 or 12. But um, still, right? That minimum wage is still what it was back then, which is the minimum required for the maintenance of life to some extent, and some it's certainly not enough for the maintenance of life in the system that in the industrial system that we live in, right? People on minimum wage, they survive more than they live, right? Which would have been the case also, I guess, for the people in the 19th century. So to some extent, like they did say in the prefaces, even almost 100 years past. No, that's more. No, that's more than 100. Almost 200 years past. those principles are still applicable to some extent, right? You can still draw parallels between our state, the state of our society, uh, which is much more socialized than it was back in their days. Uh, but it's still applicable to some extent, right? You can still see how some people could abide by the principle of the Communist Manifesto and communism as a whole. So they do take a time, like I've said before, to yes, flickering again. Yes, they do take time to address exactly how the proletarians differ from other working classes from the past, right? So we've got the handicraftsmen, as they call them, right? People who you'd call the artisans, people who do everything, who have a trade, a craft that they're able to build something from nothing and make it something that might be desirable and sellable, right? So, in contrast to the proletarian, the so-called anti-craftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past century and still exists here, there at the present. So that's, of course, in 1847, but we still have and the craftsmen, artisans, they don't have the same place in society that they had in the 17th and 18th century, for sure. But they're still present as they were in their times, right? Um, but they do say that those that still exist, they will at some point be a proletarian. At some point, they won't, right? Because to some extent, uh, in their days, it's not always that they'll be able to be desirable, but they still have to live, right? So they still have to uh, try and produce in that society. So his goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers, right? So in that time, most handicraftsmen, most manufacturing um people who own manufacturers, they were trying to get with the time, right, and be competitive and get the necessary capital to be able to enter the industrialist world of the bourgeois, right? So it's a race against time for the handicraftsman to make it so that he joins the bourgeoisie or that he joins the proletariat, right? He can often achieve this goal where guild still exists or where freedom from guild restriction has not yet led to the introduction of factory style methods into the craft, nor yet to fierce competition. But as soon as the factory system has been introduced into the uh, crafting competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away, and the craftsmen become more and more a proletarian. Or you can also have made enough capital, uh, right, and therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois or entering the middle class. The middle class was starting to appear at that time too, right? Middle class, though, they most of the time um, are in a clock ticking, right? Because if they don't make it to the bourgeoisie, they'll make it to the proletariat, and that's because of the crisis that we'll talk. Uh, well, it's already 48 minutes, so it might be more than I thought as far as what this presentation will cover, or the time it will take. Maybe we'll have to do another show on that one where well, we'll see. But yeah, the uncraftsman therefore for himself becoming either bourgeois entering the middle class in general or becoming a proletarian because of competition, right? So he's got he can straight away go into one of the two warring classes or extend his time in the middle, but eventually he'll have to uh to 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 go somewhere else, right? He'll have to join one of those two warring factions, and as they say, actually at very recent their times, it seems that most of the time they became proletarians, right? Because accruing the capital necessary to become one of the bourgeois was not an easy done. It was not an easily done thing, um, especially because of competition, right? So there's also manufacturing workers, right? People who worked in plants, or not necessarily factory, but manufacturers, bigger enterprises that's aimed at maximizing production, but still in um, a skilled or craft oriented way, right? The manufacturing workers of the 16th to the 18th century still had, with but few exceptions, instruments of production in their own possession, right? That allowed them to develop the craft that they're now uh, trying to join to a bigger enterprise, right? They did add a relation with the owner of the method of production, with the landlord or with his employer, but for the most part, they were still able to. That it was just a money relation, and but they were still able to ensure their subsistence, right? They weren't dependent as much on the relation between the exploiting class, as you could call it, right? And exploitation by itself is never is not a pejorative word, right? Life exploits other thing all the time. It's the nature of the exploitation relation that's important to study and understand always. Um, Now, they're also asking, or they're also trying to put into views what were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and of the division of society into bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? They do, uh, they do, well, I'll say them in their words. So, first, they believe that the lower and the lower prices of industrial products uh, brought by the machine labor uh, totally destroyed in all countries. Uh, the old system of manufacture, right, based upon end labor. Now they do, and that's an interesting little tidbit that I really wanted to put in there. They do say even China is now on the way to a revolution in manufacturing, right, in industrialization, and we see today that most of the reality that they're describing, right, about the state of life of the workers, they're still found in America, in Canada, in European countries, right, to some extent. But most of it, right, through globalization, has been moved to India, China, all those countries. They not long ago they were still living, their workers were still living in the conditions that are much more comparable with the state of Marx compatriots than we do, even though we're still comparable. uh, the way Chinese industry works is much more an apt parallel to some extent, right? And even then they were s- they were using China's example as well. Even they, which are completely culturally different than us, even they are going that way, right? Um, and in this way, big industry has brought all the people of the earth into contact with each other, right? Has merged all local markets into one world market, has spread civilization and progress everywhere, and has thus ensured that whatever happens in civilized countries will have repercussions in all other countries, right? When we're speaking about globalization, right? That's when it started, right? And this relation depends on it, right? And it will bring dire consequences, right? That will all be addressed in this document, right? They do say that big industry, wherever they've displaced manufacture, the bourgeoisie developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The result was that wherever this happened, the bourgeoisie took political power into its own hands and displaced the hetero ruling classes, the aristocracy, the guild masters, the representatives, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeoisie annihilated the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entailment of estates. In other words, by making landed property subject to purchase and sale, and by doing away with the special privileges of the nobility. It destroyed the power of the guildmaster by abolishing guilds and handicraft privilege. In their place, it put competition. That is a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being a lack of the necessary capital. The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on, the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal. That capital is the decisive power, that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. This it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and the recognition of free competition, and in European countries takes the form of constitutional monarchy. In these constitutional monarchies, only those who possess a certain capital are voters, that is to say, only members of the bourgeoisie. These bourgeois voters chooses the deputy, and these bourgeois deputies, by using their right to refuse to vote taxes, choose a bourgeois government. Moreover, the further this process advances, the more new labor saving machines are invented, the greater it is the pressure exercised by big industrial wages, which, as we've seen, sink to their minimum and uh, therewith, therewith render the condition of the proletariat increasingly unbearable, right? So that's interesting because, of course, right, back in those days, right, workers didn't have the right to vote, right? So it was easier for the bourgeoisie, for capitalists, to have government do their will because they were the only one who could vote anyway. And the way laws were voted, and they were making sure that it stayed that way to some extent, right? Nowadays, pretty much everybody can vote in democracies, but where uh, it's still the bourgeoisie, the industrialists, right, that chooses government is through lobbying, right? I think it's easy to see that most government caters to industries, caters to the creator of wealth, as they usually call them, to put them in a positive light, right? Well, the way they saw it was that they actually ensured the reproduction of the system that put them in power, right? I mean, both interpretation can be valid at some point. Um, but it's easy to see how some people might choose to go uh, toward a way where it's not just your capital that decides to which extent society is fit for you or not, right? Now, they go on presenting further consequences of the Industrial Revolution, in which they explain that big industry created the steam engine and other machines, the mean of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting its costs, with production thus facilitated the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while, more was produced than was needed. As a consequence, finished commodities could not be sold, and a so called commercial crisis broke out. Factories had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deep misery reigned everywhere. After a time, the superfluous product were sold. The factories began to operate again, wage rose, and gradually business got better than ever. But it was not long before too many commodities were again produced and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, the conditions of industry has constantly fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis. Nearly every 5 to 7 years, a fresh crisis has intervened, always with the greatest hardship for workers and always accompanied by general revolutionary stirring and direct peril of the old existing order of things. So remember, Blackson, you talked about how they were paying farmers to get rid of their crops, right? You remember when you were wondering why they did that? Um, yeah. So that's why, right? Because when you overproduce, it mess up the economy. So you have the government have to step in and make sure to buy that stuff, have it destroyed, so that people can keep working, right? because those kind of crises that they're describing that were already ramping up in the 19th century, they're still happening today. Those economic crises that they're still here, right? So that's a consequence of the industrial revolution, right? Because as you make always the method of production faster, better, cheaper, easier, and you produce more and more and more and more, but consumption don't follow necessarily because lots of factors, right? But thing is, this is not a sustainable level, a system of peak and crisis, right? um, So they saw that and explained that. They also explained that big industry and the limitless expansion of production, which it makes possible, bring within the range of feasibility a social order in which so much is produced that every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all his power and faculties in complete freedom, right? That was a definition of communism that we saw earlier. It thus appears that every qualities of big industry, which is our present day society, produces misery and crisis, are those which, in a different form of society, will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. Because they did see what you saw, Blackson, the other day, which is it doesn't make sense. Why waste that food? Why waste that production? If it means that we could use it so that everybody has the power and faculties to compete to complete uh, everybody's in position to exercise and develop all their powers and faculties in complete freedom, right? Because all their needs are met. But no, we use this ability to produce well enough for everybody um to to have an economy that destroys this product instead of getting it to the people who need it, right? And they saw very early on that this was unjustifiable to some extent, right? It was a proof that the system was not to work, but they also saw it as a proof that, well, the methods of it, right? They points toward a different system, a different societal system that could use this production in a better way, right? Instead of destroying it, or instead of in that time they didn't destroy the production, right? In that time, since worker didn't matter, they basically just fired everyone, said go die somewhere in a dark corner, right? And if you're still alive when we need production, you'll be able to come back and try and live at that point, right? So uh, those days, right? It seems like evil the way it's said, right? But that's the way it was before those principles were somewhat integrated in our modern society. Um, okay, so perfect. So they do ask the question, what will the new social order have to be like, right? That will better use this production. And they say that above all, it will have to take the control of industry and of all the branches of production out of the hands of mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all these branches of production are operated by society as a whole, that is, for the common account, according to a common plan, and with the participation of all members of society. It will, in other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. Now, in my mind, a world where we stop competing in each other and start cooperating with each other, that sounds like a better world, right? I mean, I can understand how some people are enticed to this idea of let's try not to compete with each other. Maybe compete for fun in baseball, right? But when it comes to life, let's not compete with each other and try to cooperate, collaborate, associate with each other, right? Moreover, since the management of industry by individuals necessarily implies private property, and since competition is in reality merely the manner and form in which the control of industry by private property owners express itself, it follows that private property cannot be separated from competition and the individual management of industry. Private property must, therefore, be abolished, and in its place must come the common utilization of all instruments of production and the distribution distribution of all product according to common agreement. In a word, what is called the communal ownership of goods. Now, since we're already past the hour mark, I don't think we're going to get in the manifesto itself tonight. But in the manifesto itself, they do explain that private property takes many forms, and they don't want to abolish all forms of private property. But when it comes to the means of production, to industry, that's definitely something that needs to be socialized, right? That needs to be that never needs to be into private hands. Um, then uh, they asked if would have been possible to abolish private property earlier. And they do explain that as long as it's not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding the social capital and extending the forces of production, so long as this is not possible, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society productive forces and a poor oppressed class. How these classes are constituted depend on the stage of development. It is clear that up to now, the forces of production have never been developed to the point where enough could be developed for all, and that private property has become a fetter and barrier in relation to the further development of the forces of production, right? Now, I think it's hard to disagree that if we can take the time to build Xboxes for millions of people, surely we could find the time to feed everybody, right? If we can take the time to pay baseball players or hockey players millions of dollars, we can find a way to feed most people, right? If we can build futuristic cities in the desert and um, basically make sure that everybody has enough to drink by filtering seawater with multi-million dollar machines so that again those people can live in the middle of goddamn desert, we can feed all people, right? Instead, to some extent. So it's all about making sure that, right, as if there's not enough, they do recognize that society needed those classes to clash. They needed ruling class and exploited classes. They're not about to pretend that society was always in a position to allow this kind of revolution. But it was their prerogative that the industry that was starting to take place or that started to take place before them, but was getting more and more ubiquitous in their time, especially nowadays. It's hard to argue that if we're willing to sacrifice a bit of luxury, we could ensure that uh, everybody's needs are met. Right now, that's not necessarily the discussion of today, but they saw or they thought that it was already possible back then. So it's hard to argue that it would not be possible today if it was indeed possible back then. Um, and now that question, right? The hard question of will the peaceful abolition of private property be possible? They're not naive, right? They do say that it would be desirable if this could happen, and that the communists would certainly be the last to oppose it. But they know too well that because well, they know too well that conspiracy are not only useless but harmful. They know that revolutions are not made intentionally and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and always they have been necessary consequences of condition which were wholly independent of the will and direction of individual parties and entire classes. So when those big societal changes, they're not as much planned as direct consequences and inevitabilities to some extent, right? So, uh, their point was, if it does happen in a peaceful way, that's great, but it's not guaranteed that it can happen because big change in societies rarely do happen peacefully. Um, the change from feudalism to the industrial world that we have today did not happen peacefully, right? They chopped a couple heads to get to that. So, at least in France. But they also see that development of the proletariat in nearly all civilized countries has been violently suppressed, right? And that in that way, the opponents of communism have been working towards a revolution with all their strength. If the oppressed proletariat is finally driven to revolution, then they state that the communists will defend the interests of the proletarians with deeds, as they are at that point doing it only with words. Um, Now, history would show a couple of those instances. Now, they come back again to the idea that is it possible to abolish that private property in all one stroke, and they reiterate that it's no more possible uh, to do that than it is for existing forces of production to be at one stroke multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of communal society, right? In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when means of production are available in sufficient quantity. So they do recognize that the technology would allow to produce sufficiently for enough for everybody, but they do understand that in the way it's currently done with the competition and the lack of cooperation, that they're not yet in a position where it can um, uh, be sufficient for everybody, right? It has to be focused to that end and not just, uh, well, to some extent, we could say towards luxury goods and towards different private interests. Um, Now, the following question is what will be the course of this revolution? And there they reiterate that above all, it will be established through a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or indirect dominance of the proletariat. It's very important to them that whatever happens is done through democracy, right? So uh, it's a part of communism that's often forgotten, that they believe so much in the democratic process, but I believe it's an important one because it shows that never they intend to have one person um, put their will as the will of the people. They want the people to get there, right? And they're explaining how, they're explaining to the proletariat how they should strive for that, right? But at the end of the day, that's their prerogative if they follow that way, right? And the argument of Marx and Engels is that that would be the natural progression of way if you look at how history unfolded. And they do ask, will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? At which point they say no, that the same way that the Industrial Revolution created the world market, it's almost impossible right now to go back and uh, have independent nations, independent entities with no relations to each other, right? That so if if the communist ideal is to be achieved, it will at some point necessarily have to um, bring together in the fold. Again, though, the the different productions, right? The different decisions that the different democratic entities would take would not necessarily all be the same. It would all be towards the benefit of society, right? So if uh, we end up with a global society, right? Well, the well-being of the global still depends on the well-being of the local, and the 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 system of administration that they propose, that we'll see more of um, in later presentations, I guess, um, does explain that it's a local effort, even though it, the concern of society or the concern of producing for society instead, uh, for the benefit of society instead of the benefit of the individual, should end up at some point a globalized ideal. Um, Now, They then go and ask what will be the consequences of the ultimate disappearance of private property, in which they state that instead of generating misery, overproduction will reach beyond the elementary requirement of society to assure the satisfaction of the needs of all. It will create new needs and at the same time the means to satisfy them. It will become the condition of and the stimulus to new progress, which will no longer throw the whole social order into confusion as progress has always done in the past. In this way, such an abundance of good will be able to satisfy the needs of all its members. The division of society into different mutually hostile classes will then become unnecessary. Indeed, it will be not only unnecessary but intolerable in the new social order. Sorry. The existence of classes originated in the division of labor, and the division of labor, as it has been known up to the present, will completely disappear. For mechanical and chemical processes are not enough to bring industrial and agricultural production up to the level we have described. The capacities of the men who make use of these processes must undergo a corresponding development. Just as the peasant and manufacturing workers of the last century changed their whole way of life and became quite different people when they were drawn into big industry, in the same way, communal control over the production of society as a whole and the resulting new development will both require an entirely different of human material. People will no longer be, as they are today, subordinated into a single branch of production, bound to it, exploited by it. They will no longer develop one of their faculties at the expense of all others. They will no longer know only one branch and one branch of a single branch or production as a whole. Even industry, as it is today, is finding such people less and less useful. And that's right, right? The way that uh, the way that the division of labor uh, has been uh, tending towards specialization, most companies, even nowadays, uh, and as they say, it was happening back then, are asking for a more diverse skill set, right? So uh, this over specialization that was taking place in their time was already in the industrial system starting to fail, but they do say that uh, that those changes in the the way that humans evolve in the working environment, right? It, it, it's expected, right? When the means of production change, always will the people involved in the production change according to those means of production, right? And so they do believe that uh, the way workers are, the way workers think, the way workers socially behave will change when those means of productions are socialized, right? When they're not private property anymore, when they're not uh, working towards the good of individuals, right? That are the top, the bourgeois, uh, whereas when you work, you're motivated only by your salary and not by the necessarily by the ultimate achievement of your work. By making this production for society, it becomes in itself the motivation. It becomes in itself the reason, and it becomes the sustenance of this effort, right? Because everything is geared toward the progress of everybody, but the progress of each is a condition for the progress of everybody. Nobody's left behind, right? Some people don't get to have all their desires fulfilled, while some people don't have their basic needs fulfilled, right? No, I think I took a little bit of advance with that statement, but they also state that education will enable young people to quickly familiarize themselves with the whole system of production and to pass from one branch of production to another in response to the needs of society or to their own inclination. It will therefore free them for the one sided character which the present day division of labor impresses upon every individual communist society will. In this way, make it possible. Well, communist society will in this way make it possible for its members to put their comprehensive developed faculties to full use, but when this happens, classes will necessarily disappear. It follows that society organized on a communist basis is incompatible with the existence of classes on the one hand, and that the very building of such society provide the mean of abolishing class difference on the other. So that's interesting because that's also something that we can see in our current society to some extent, our current socialized society, right? Social democrat society. The fact that nowadays people will change field, right? Someone that was uh, I'm a good example of that. I was a teacher and now I work in IT, right? I've been able through education to change fields according to the need of society or to my inclination, right? It just so happened that my inclination might be more towards teaching, but I found a way to combine the technology in teaching because society, especially during COVID, needed much more people in technology, right? So I managed to get a much better salary, a much better situation by following the needs of society, right, in our capitalistic society. But this possibility is expected from a communist world, right? And the getting a better salary is not a question. Uh, it's all about your inclination or the needs of society, right? Um, that's, I think, what they call freedom to some extent, right? To be able to follow the needs of society or follow your inclinations, but not being limited by a factor on which you have not much control, right? Um, what will be the attitude of communists to existing nationalities? So, as we said before, the nationalities of the people associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estates and class distinction must disappear through the abolition of their basis. So, they expect that nationalities they also result in modern nationalities. They also result from this arrangement of the classes of the production of the economic system, and that if you remove the basis of those nationalities, that they should also dissolve and disappear. And that brings us to the last two slides for tonight, um, which is the role of the state in all this. And that's in a different book, right, written in 1877, that Engels uh, explains in much more detail his position on the subject. So I'll read those two slides, and then Blackson, we can have a discussion if you want. Uh, so they do say that the transformation either into joint stock companies or into state ownership does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. In the joint stock companies, this is obvious, and in the modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society take on in order to support the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of productions against the encroachment as well of the worker as of individual capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalist, the idea of personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizen does it exploit, the the more citizen does it exploit. Sorry. The worker remains wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. It's rather brought to a head, but brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive force is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the element to that solution. So, state ownership of property, of means of production, is a transition aspect, right? because the goal is that the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production in the first instance into a state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinction and class antagonism, abolishes also the state as state. Society, thus far, based upon class and antagonism, at need of the state, that is, of an organization of the particular class, which was pro tempore the exploiting class, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore, especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the condition of oppression corresponding with the given mode of production, be it slavery, serfdom, wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only in so far as it was the state of that class, which itself represented for the time being society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave owning citizen. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords. In our time, the bourgeoisie, lobbyist, if you will. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the as soon as class rule and the individual struggle of existence based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collision and excess arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. This is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of person is replaced by the administration of things, and then by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase a free people's state, both as to its justifiable use at time by agitators and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so called anarchist for the abolition of the state out of hand. So the abolishment of state is not really the abolishment of state as much as the state becoming irrelevant as society modifies itself to be for the people, by the people, right? I think the American Constitution says that at some point. All right, so there's still a lot we haven't touched at all at the actual manifesto, but it's been an hour and a half already, so I'm guessing that it might be a four-parter more than a three-parter, this whole experiment of ours. Um, I know it was a lot of me talking today. I hope it wasn't too boring and that this presentation did help to make it clear what were the main principles of communism as they were created, right? And how they differentiate from what other views of communism and socialism people might have. Actually, that last part I think might become more clear when we go through the actual manifesto, because in the different drafts I voluntarily skipped the part about where they differentiate from socialism, because it's better explained in the manifesto. I much more like the explanation in the manifesto, so that's going to be the hook for next time. So Blackson, any comments, any thoughts?
I don't want to be long because yeah, we went over an hour and 30, but the need for this to be a global power poses a problem because why not just separate the people who want that to one part and the people that want something different to another part? You know, that I heard what you
I
said
guess that's
about.
entirely possible to some extent, right?
That's always been
as long
my.
as everybody agree on that separation, and that one
I,
side
I think
doesn't
that
want to go get what's on the other side, right?
right, and I think there should be a separation more than trying to because and that's the problem with Islam. Islam wants a world domination. Every time somebody wants to apply a world because capitalism, I think, like I said,
Capitalism wants world domination too,
right,
and they
right.
pretty
And I
much
think,
on the way to have it.
I don't think neither one should have world domination.
Yeah.
I think that people that choose, just like here in the U.S., I think that people who, you got red states and blue states. I feel like if you really believe in a red state, move to a red state. Believe in a blue state,
So,
blue. I believe the same way with communism, socialism, and capitalism. I think people should just be separated.
well, that's
They say
a
it's
view,
dangerous that
right?
way.
But what they're saying is not that
Yeah,
it's
but even if it's a few,
imperative that it becomes a global thing. What they're saying is
yes,
that
that's the problem. I got.
they believe that it will become a global thing, and that it can only work as a global thing.
Well, that's the danger.
If people no, well, that's the danger. That's their
That's the
opinion,
danger
right?
because humans are
That
not
if
monolithic.
huh?
We're not monolithic. But I mean,
Well,
history has
no,
shown
well,
over and over again.
that's we are and we're not, right? As humans, there are some things that are universal, there are some things that are not. But
Well, the economic
what he's
systems are
saying
definitely not.
is basically just I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's going to be done globally in one fell swoop, but he does believe that gradually, globally, is going to take on everywhere. If people find a way to make it work without being global, um, perfect. But then again, if we draw a line in the middle of the earth, right,
Hmm.
and say we don't cross that line under any circumstances, then global just took another word because now we've got two globes, right? You've got two
Yeah,
worlds.
I
So it
mean,
can
well,
still be global in
we
that
got more than two
particular
worlds. We
arena,
actually got
right?
multiple.
So
Yeah, but we
it's
got multiple worlds right now. We got multiple worlds. So you just talking
well,
about
no,
just two worlds,
we've got
right?
the globalized world of the UN. We've got free markets that are enforced
Hmm.
with wars everywhere around the world. Right now, we've got capitalist or the bourgeoisie trying to make a one government out of the current world that we
Right. I
have,
don't
and
agree with that. Right.
fighting
I
everybody
don't.
with weapons of mass destruction in the
Well,
process.
let me close out by
So,
saying this because I know because we're way over the time. What I'm saying that just my take, just this particular, I don't agree with any world global, whether it be capitalism or socialism or communism or Christianity or Islam. I don't think there should be any one world ideology. I think that's dangerous.
well,
Human,
again, he doesn't speak about any kind of ideology, right? He just speaks about the fact that he believes that people
right? Oh, okay,
working
belief
towards the
system.
greater good
Okay,
of their community is something that will be global at some point, in the
okay,
sense that
okay. And
he's not
again,
talking about a global culture. He's talking about the fact
hmm,
that societies, in order to be sustainable, will have to work with societies as an aim, right? With individual as an aim. Uh, but of course, um, global governments have always been a point of contention. Whoever wants to implement them. But if we think of ourselves as a species on a planet where there might be species on other planets, right? At some point, when are we going to realize, well, we're Earthlings and we have to stand together, right?
yeah, but everybody have different ideas. But hey, we gonna save that. We gonna save that, man. I wanna like I said, we went well over the mark, so we just have to time this. But yeah, um, I want to give a shout out to you, Zanzi. Thank you for giving that presentation. Shout out to everybody in the chat, and we will see y'all next week. We out.
Thank you, everybody who listened.
All right, peace, y'all.